Hello guys, today I want to do a short video to talk about Chinese second language imaginative writing because I found this task is actually very difficult for the students who are doing Chinese second language studies. So I'm gonna spend quite a few minutes to go through what teacher is actually expecting to see from your imaginative writing. From you can see here, I've divided this task into two different sections. So I'll be talking about the structure, what you have to write in a story, as well as your conclusion. And on the right side, you have the criteria. So I tend to use the simpler criteria to explain to my students, and then before we're actually doing this practice, so they will get a very detailed marking criteria, rubrics. Okay, let's get started. So normally this task requires students to write about 250 to 300 characters in Chinese. So this is actually a written task. But as I said before, many students found this task is really difficult because not only you have to have creative mind, but also you need to actually think of a storyline. And at the end of your story, you also need to give the audience a very positive note or the moral. So that's why makes the whole structure very hard to write. So I'll go from the introduction. So basically for the intro and conclusion, you're actually writing about %10 each of the total word count. So I'm suggesting your body paragraph, actually you do 80% of your words in there because that's the focus of this written piece. So for your introduction, basically very briefly, tell me the setting of your story, the background of your story, and the people in the story. But you have to bear in mind, most of the story, you have to use first person to start with, I. If in the question, they already clarified it's a third person, you have to follow that, but most of the cases, we use first person to write imaginative story. Once I write your introduction, I want to go straight into your storyline, which is your plot. So in your body paragraphs, what I'm asking you to do is give me two twists, highlights, or you call climax. So in your story, I want to see up and downs, but the reason I said two highlights, twists, or climax in your story is because you want to actually grab your audience attention with up and downs, but you don't want to give them too much. If you give them too many highlights in your story, your whole story will be like highlights, so you can't see where is the emphasis of the story, right? Another reason for giving out two highlights of your story is because when teacher mark your story, writing is very subjective thing. So some teacher may not realize that's your highlight of the story. So they keep reading to the second highlights. Maybe they feel like this is your highlight. So writing two climax of your story is just to make sure the teacher can pick out one to give you marks. Okay. Your story has to be something that's not going to happen in reality. By in reality, what I mean is you have to go wild with your imagination. Okay? After the whole story, I want you to think about what's your highlights in the story. And what are the highlights? And then those highlights will link to your conclusion, because in your conclusion, you have to go back to the story and telling me what moral you're writing in your conclusion. That is linked back to your story. So from reading your story and plot, I can sort of guess what type of morals you want to put in the conclusion. You have to remember in your conclusion, your message in the conclusion has to be positive. That's one of the criteria. Has to be positive, meaningful, not that you actually directed from your story. You direct your audience to read your story and then give them the moral in the end. So that's the whole structure of a imaginative writing. You know what to put in the intro, what to write for the body paragraph, and then what moral you have to include in the conclusion. Now let's move on to the criteria. I'll quickly talk about this. If you see, I put a few numbers there. So in this instance, I say 10 is the full mark for the criteria. So when I divided your criteria into 3 different components, which are content, structure, language. So I put 3, 3, 4 for each aspect in your criteria, which means your content, of course, is your story, will be 30% of the criteria. Your structure, I want to see your intro, the 2 body paragraphs, I want to see the conclusion, and make sure the text type is correct. Normally, it will tell you what text type you're required to write in the question, saying a letter, a diary entry, a speech, or a magazine article. So you have to be careful and read your question very carefully. Make sure you put in the right text type when you write the story. You can also call this format, so that's part of the structure. And then 40% is your language. Okay, what do you mean by language here? It's actually, we're learning a second language, we're learning Chinese, right? I want to make sure you're using the right vocabulary, right grammar points, right sentence structure. You can even give me a few complex sentences or like Chinese idioms and phrases to make sure your language points are there. So when I use these 3 criteria to explain the imaginative writing, it's very easy to see. So out of 10 marks, you've got 3 parts you have to fulfill, and you got 30%, 30%, and 40% for each component. So when you start learning and writing creative piece, you want to think about, did I cover all 3? Did I follow the structure here? Did I do a very brief intro and conclusion? Did I do the setting, background, and first person? Did I give the audience 2 climax in my story? Did I actually give the audience a very meaningful note and a positive moral in the end? So if you can cover all of this, you're actually doing a pretty decent imaginative writing. And the rest is actually up to the teacher or like marker to judge whether you're producing actually a great piece or a decent piece or like a normal piece or just an okay piece. So I feel like after talking about the concept of imaginative writing, I might give you an example, so just to help you to better understand the concept here. For say, in 50 years, or this is a question, okay, in 50 years, human beings and robots will live together on Earth. Okay, write an imaginative story in your diary to talk about what's gonna happen when we were living together. This is a very broad topic. And you can see the text type here is a diary entry, right? And you know the setting and the background, which is in 50 years. So it's from now to the future. Sometimes you see topics from now to the past. You want to make sure the timeline is correct. And you know who are in the story, which is human being or robot. But in this story, it didn't tell you which person you want to use. So I would say first person. I say, I live in that time with robot, okay? So basically, you've got the contents covered in intro. In your body paragraph, you can think of all sorts of story to write. But the example I'm going to give you is actually, I hired or maybe I bought a robot butler. So he looked after like everything in my life. He cook for me, clean my house, doing work for me, everything. Okay, that's basically my story. And that's basically the first highlight of my story because I don't have to do anything in my life. I have the butler, the robot butler, to help me with everything in my life. Okay, what about my second highlight? I would say I lived with the robot for 5 years, but one day suddenly this butler stopped working, stopped functioning. Okay, and that's when I realized I can't do anything in my life by myself independently because I was so relied on the butler to do anything for me. I lose my ability to live on my own. That's the second highlight of my story. Okay, now once my story, my plot is done, I want to think about what type of moral I want to put in the conclusion. So in here, I might do everything happens for a reason. You don't want to sit around and you think everything is done for you. You don't want surprises as well. That's when the robot stopped working, right? So you still have to make effort to make things work. So basically, I have the moral here, which is a positive, inspiring moral. I've got a story, 2 highlights, very basic. Basic storyline. If you want to go crazy, wild, think about all different type of stories, plots, you can, but you have to make sure your moral is linked back to the story. There is a connection there. And my intro was pretty clear as well. I've got settings, background, and everything covered in there. So once I finish my draft of the story, I want to check my criteria. Is my content okay? Did I get the right structure? Did I put in the diary entry as my text type? And what vocabulary, grammar points, sentence structure I want to use in my writing? And then you've covered everything you need to do in imaginative writing.